Lionel Jonson's return is one of the most significant events in recent Warhammer 40K lore. So, in this video, I'm going to tell you the complete story of how one of Emperor's greatest sons went from a scattered infant to a returned saviour, and why his awakening after 10,000 years might be humanity's last hope in its darkest hour. But first, we need some context. The Emperor of Mankind created 20 genetically engineered sons called the Primarchs. Each was designed to be a perfect superhuman warrior and leader, intended to command vast armies in his conquest of the galaxy. But before they could grow up, the Chaos Gods, malevolent entities from a dimension called the Warp, scattered these infant Primarchs across the galaxy in a desperate attempt to deny the Emperor his greatest weapons. Lionel Jonson was one of these babies, hurled through space and time to land on a world that would shape him into one of the most formidable warriors the galaxy has ever known. The baby lion crashed on Caliban, a feudal death world covered in massive forests filled to the brim with dangerous warp-corrupted creatures called the Great Beasts. Unlike many of his brothers who were found and raised by caring families, Lion spent his earliest years alone in these deadly forests. He had to learn to survive by hunting the very creatures that others fled from. By the time he was discovered by human knights, he'd already become something of a legend among the forest dwellers. Lion was found by Luther, a knight of a secret organisation simply called the Order. Luther was already a respected warrior and leader who had dedicated his life to protecting Caliban's people from the great beasts. When he discovered this strange child who could hunt monsters with his bare hands, Luther saw potential that went far beyond anything he had imagined. Luther adopted Lion as his own son, and the two formed what seemed like an unbreakable bond. Under Luther's guidance, Lion learned the ways of knighthood, strategy, and leadership. His natural Primarch abilities made him an incredibly fast learner, and soon he went from participating in hunts against the great beasts to leading them. The Order had spent generations barely holding the line against these monsters, but Lion's arrival changed everything. Together, Lion and Luther launched campaign after campaign, systematically hunting down and destroying the great beasts that had plagued Caliban for centuries. Lion's tactical genius and supernatural combat abilities, combined with Luther's experience and leadership, made them an unstoppable team. They absorbed or defeated rival knightly orders across the planet, uniting Caliban under Lion's leadership, while Luther served as his most trusted advisor and father figure. By the time Lion reached adulthood, Caliban was free of the great beast that had terrorized it for millennia. Lion had become the planet's undisputed ruler, and Luther stood proudly at his side as the man who had raised this legend. But this golden age was about to face its greatest test. At the outset of the Great Crusade, the Emperor arrived on Caliban, and he immediately recognised Lion as one of his lost sons. It was at this moment that the Primarch learnt his true purpose in the galaxy. The Emperor offered Lion command of the First Legion, the Dark Angels, along with the chance to join the Great Crusade to reunite humanity across the stars. For someone who had already conquered his entire world, the prospect of galactic conquest was irresistible. Lion accepted without hesitation. Luther, despite his crucial role in Lion's development, faced a devastating reality. He was too old to undergo the genetic modifications needed to become a Space Marine, the superhuman warriors who would serve alongside the Primarchs. While Lion would become an immortal demigod leading armies across the galaxy, Luther would remain a normal human being, aging and eventually dying, while his adopted son achieved eternal glory. And this was the seed of a tragedy that would eventually tear this father-son relationship apart. Lion took command of the Dark Angels and proved himself to be one of the most effective Primarchs in the Great Crusade. His tactical brilliance and strategic mind made the Dark Angels one of the most feared and respected legions in the Imperial arsenal. But Lion had a problem with authority that went beyond his father, the Emperor. He'd been raised as a ruler, not a follower, and he often pursued his own military objectives rather than following direct orders. Lion fought side battles and campaigns on and around Caliban, sometimes coordinating with other Imperial forces, sometimes operating entirely independently. Lion remained loyal to the Emperor and the Imperial cause, but his independent streak and secretive nature made him difficult to predict and sometimes challenging to work with, even for his brother Primarchs. Meanwhile, Luther remained on Caliban, normally helping to recruit new Dark Angels from the planet's population. But while Lion travelled the galaxy earning glory and recognition, Luther grew frustrated, stuck in what felt like an administrative role, watching his adopted son achieve everything he had once dreamed of for himself. The resentment began to grow. Years passed and Lion grew more powerful and distant. Luther aged and watched Caliban change under Imperial rule. The Chaos Gods, always seeking to corrupt the Emperor's servants, found fertile ground in Luther's growing doubts about Lion's leadership and the Imperial truth itself. What began as legitimate concerns about Caliban's treatment slowly twisted into something darker under Chaos influence. The problem wasn't just personal jealousy, though that was certainly part of it. Luther genuinely believed he could lead Caliban and its people better than Lion, who spent most of his time fighting wars in distant sectors of the galaxy. Luther began to see Lion's absence as an abandonment of his homeworld and the people who had raised him. What made this even worse was that Luther wasn't entirely wrong. Lion had become so focused on galactic conquest and proving himself to the Emperor that he had indeed unknowingly neglected Caliban and the people who had shaped him into the leader he had become. This growing resentment found fertile ground when whispers of chaos began reaching Caliban, and Luther's feelings of abandonment and jealousy made him particularly vulnerable to their influence. Luther began secretly gathering followers among the Dark Angels stationed on Caliban, sharing his grievances and slowly building a faction that questioned Lion's leadership and loyalty to their homeworld. The situation came to a head during the galaxy-spanning civil war known as the Horus Heresy, when Lion's brother Horus turned against the Emperor and tried to claim the throne for himself. This massive conflict split the Imperium in half and forced every Primarch to choose sides. Lion remained loyal to the Emperor, but the chaos of the Civil War meant that communication across the galaxy became sporadic and unreliable. Luther used this confusion to his advantage, spreading rumours that Lion had been corrupted by the war and was planning to abandon Caliban entirely. When Lion finally returned to Caliban near the end of the Heresy, he found a world in open rebellion against him. Luther had convinced a significant portion of the Dark Angels garrison that Lion was no longer the leader they had once followed. The confrontation was inevitable. Luther, now secretly empowered by chaos energies, challenged Lion to single combat in the fortress monastery known as the Rock. The two men who had once hunted monsters together as father and son now faced each other as enemies. Lion was physically more powerful, but Luther fought with the desperate fury of someone who felt he'd been betrayed and abandoned by the person he loved most. Their battle was so intense, so charged with psychic energy and raw emotion, that it literally tore Caliban apart. The planet's surface cracked and shattered, and massive chunks of the world were scattered into space by the sheer force of their conflict. In the end, Lion emerged victorious, but the cost was devastating. Luther lay defeated, but not before striking a blow that left Lion severely wounded and psychically damaged. The man who had raised him, taught him, and loved him was broken both physically and mentally by their final confrontation. The psychic trauma from battling Luther left Lion mortally wounded and in a comatose state. In the chaos that followed Caliban's destruction, Lion L. Jonson simply vanished. Unknown to the Dark Angels, including their own leadership, the mysterious Watchers in the Dark had spirited Lion's broken body away in the most secret chamber deep within the rock, where they tended to his wounds for 10,000 years. For 10 millennia, Lion slept while the galaxy he had helped conquer slowly decayed around him. The Imperium became exactly the kind of stagnant religious autocracy that the Emperor had tried to prevent. Humanity's golden age of expansion ended, replaced by an era of fear, superstition, and slow decline. By the 41st millennium, the Imperium faced its greatest crisis since the Horus Heresy. The galaxy had been literally split in half by a massive warp storm called the Great Rift, dividing human space into two regions. The Imperium Sanctus, where the Emperor's psychic beacon called the Astronomicon could still guide ships, and the Imperium Nihilus, a nightmare realm where chaos ran rampant and Imperial forces struggled to maintain any semblance of order. Into this crisis stepped a new threat, Vashtorr the Arkifane, an ambitious chaos entity aligned with machinery, mad science, and technological corruption. Vashtorr sought to become a full chaos god by constructing a mysterious superweapon called the Key, and he aligned with Abaddon the Despoiler, the former first captain of the Sons of Horus, who had taken over leadership of chaos forces after Horus' death. Together, they launched the Arks of Omen campaign, deploying massive warp-powered battle fleets to search for components of this key across war zones, space hulks, and even heavily defended Imperial worlds. The campaign was devastating, with entire systems falling to chaos as these arcs appeared seemingly from nowhere and overwhelmed local defences. The rock itself became a target when Chaos forces identified it as containing something of strategic importance. What they didn't know was that their assault would accomplish something the Dark Angels had been hoping for across 10,000 years. It would wake Lionel Jonson. During the Arks of Omen campaign, Vashtorr led a direct assault on the rock itself with his Ark of Omen. The combination of this unprecedented violation of their fortress monastery and the psychic turbulence from the Great Rift created conditions that finally stirred Lion from his healing sleep. After 10 millennia, the Primarch awaked to find the galaxy in an even worse state than when he'd fallen. The Watchers in the Dark, who had faithfully guarded Lion through his long recovery, recognised that their vigil was finally complete. These ancient beings, with their own mysterious understanding of the war against chaos, had preserved Lion for precisely this moment when the galaxy would need him the most. But Lion didn't emerge unchanged from his long sleep. The psychic trauma that had placed him in stasis had also awaked new abilities within him. He discovered he could now forest walk, a supernatural ability which transported him to a mist-shrouded realm that resembled a mirror version of Caliban. This allowed him and his troops to travel all across the Imperium Nihilus. Lion armed himself with ancient relics befitting a returned Primarch, including the legendary Emperor's Shield, a weapon of immense power capable of turning aside even demon blades and protecting its bearer from the worst chaos could unleash. Rather than immediately announcing his return, Lion chose to operate in secret within the Imperium Nihilus, the nightmarish half of the galaxy cut off from the Emperor's light. Here, isolated Imperial forces were fighting desperate battles against chaos incursions, often without hope of reinforcement or even communication with the broader Imperium. Imperial forces under siege would suddenly find themselves reinforced by mysterious Dark Angels led by a figure who seemed too skilled and too powerful to be entirely human. Survivors would speak of a warrior who could appear from nowhere, strike decisive blows against Chaos forces, and vanish as quickly as he came. But this galaxy war was building towards a confrontation that would announce Lion's return to the entire galaxy. The climax of Lion's secret campaign came when he encountered Angron, one of his brother Primarchs who had turned to Chaos during the Horus Heresy. Angron had become a Daemon Prince of Khorne, the Chaos god of war and bloodshed, transforming from a tragic figure into a creature of pure violence and rage. Angron represented everything that had gone wrong with the galaxy since Lion had fallen into a coma. Where Lion fought with purpose and strategy, Angron embodied mindless destruction. Where Lion sought to protect the innocent, Angron revelled in slaughter. The battle between them was epic in scope, with Lion's tactical brilliance and new abilities pitted against Angron's raw demonic power and endless fury. Lion's childhood on Caliban had taught him how to fight monsters far larger and more powerful than himself, and he used every lesson Luther taught him about confronting seemingly impossible odds. Angron was physically more powerful, enhanced by chaos energies and driven by 10,000 years of accumulated rage. But Lion fought with the cunning and patience that had made him such an effective leader during the Great Crusade. He used Angron's own aggression against him, turning the Demon Prince's charges into opportunities for counterattacks. Taking advantage of this opening, Lion struck with both his sword and the Emperor's shield, dealing wounds that even Angron's demonic resilience couldn't immediately heal. In the end, Lion's strategy overcame Angron's fury. Using a technique that combined his natural combat abilities with his new supernatural powers, Lion managed to banish Angron back to the warp, sending the Demon Prince screaming back to the Chaos Realm where he would need time to regenerate his physical form. This victory announced Lion's return to the galaxy in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Word spread rapidly through both Imperial and Chaos forces. Lionel Jonson was back, and he was more dangerous than ever. The Arks of Omen campaign eventually ended with Vashtorr escaping with a partially completed key, meaning the immediate crisis was resolved, but the larger threat remained. However, the campaign's conclusion marked the beginning of a new chapter in the galaxy's history, one where Lionel Jonson was once again an active force. The damage from the campaign was substantial. Entire worlds had fallen to chaos and the Imperium's resources were stretched thinner than ever. But Lion's return provided something the Imperium desperately needed. Proof that legends could return and that the Emperor's greatest champions weren't all gone forever. Lion now operates openly as one of the only 2 loyal Primarchs confirmed to be active in the galaxy, alongside his brother Rabute Guilliman, who rules the Imperium as Lord Commander. But where Guilliman focuses on administration and large-scale Imperial governance, Lion has returned to what he does best: strategic warfare and direct action against the Imperium's enemies. The Lion's awakening has reinvigorated the Dark Angels and provided new hope to Imperial forces throughout the galaxy, but it's also raised new questions about what his 10,000 year sleep might have changed about him, and what other secrets the Dark Angels have been keeping all these millennia.